Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Albert. In this show, I talk about technology, building a company as a CTO and co-founder, and have guests to discuss their roles in technology and entrepreneurship. Today, we're joined by Joe Morgan of Lawrence, Kansas, a author, user interface developer, a JavaScript enthusiast, and the founder and co-organizer of Kansas City React Meetup. Thanks so much for joining us, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm really glad we got this set up. So if you want to give a little bit more of just a description of your background and what brought you to the field, and what's your day-to-day, what you're working on.
Sure. So I came into the field kind of in a strange direction, which is actually pretty typical, it seems, of a lot of web developers. I don't have any formal training in computer science or any of that stuff, but I got started doing web development because I needed things on the web, and I didn't have the resources to have other people do it, and I figured I could figure it out on my own. So I actually started off my career as a librarian, and I created digital libraries from some smaller departments in a university, and worked for a public library for a while. And so that was kind of my first step into the web world. And I found myself mainly doing HTML and CSS, but then I gravitated towards JavaScript, in part because as a librarian, no one really trusted me with the server-side code. But for some reason, they let me put in whatever JavaScript I wanted. So I realized that once the server did its thing, I could start making changes. And, so I started off doing a lot of things that were popular 10 or so years ago, sliders and carousels and all that fun stuff. And I found that I actually really liked it. I really liked JavaScript in particular, and then programming in general. And it was funny because that was kind of around the time that JavaScript was at its low point. I remember it used to be every time you go look for an answer about something on JavaScript on Stack Overflow or whatever, the first 3 or 4 answers would be people complaining about how much they hated JavaScript. But I always kind of liked it because I liked the functional aspect of it. I didn't know what that was at the time, but I liked the way you could pass around functions from place to place that kind of synced with how I thought about things naturally. And so started doing that more and more, started doing that full time, and got to be pretty good at it. I'd like to think, at least. And so started doing some speaking, and eventually got the chance to write a book. And the book was kind of my way of talking about JavaScript in its most basic and simple form. And so one of the things that I always talk about when I talk to other developers, when I'm talking to new developers, is how hard it is to make things simple. That sounds counterintuitive, but making things simple and clear actually takes a lot more work, because usually as developers, we tend to focus on the product, the final goal. So we're hacking away, trying to get that stuff to render. And then when it finally does, we're so exhausted that we kind of ship it and move on. Whereas really the craftsmanship part of it is taking that working solution and making it into something that's clean and clear and reusable. So that's kind of how that came about.
Yeah, I laugh because I can very much relate to the instinct to want to ship a first draft and knowing that that's not the right move. Because if you ship your first draft, you're going to have to edit it. It may not be today, but it's going to be worse because you're not going to remember how you did it in a week or a month or a year. And you're going to have to relearn what you did in the mindset of someone who doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
I like to say that some of the worst code I've seen is what I wrote 6 months ago. And that happens every 6 months. So if you're not improving, then what are you doing? So yeah, I can very much relate to that. So what did coming from the librarian field or the library sciences field influence the way that you went about writing the book? I mean, beyond just the way of bringing back to the simplicity of which simplifying JavaScript is the title of the book, right?
Right. Yep, I should have given the title. Yeah, it's called Simplifying JavaScript. I don't know. I think maybe the librarian part of me came out. I use a lot of books as examples, so maybe that's part of it.
Uh-huh.
But I think more of it is before I was a librarian. When I was an undergraduate, I studied philosophy, and so philosophy is all about breaking down problems until they're smaller and smaller and smaller until you have the tiniest most part, and then really trying to understand that. And so that's what I think comes out a lot more. So, some of those questions of what is it mean to make it simple and easy to read? Those are really basic questions. And then other things like, what can someone know by looking at something? What can someone expect to see based off of other parts? One of my favorite parts in the book is I talk about array methods, and array methods are pretty popular in JavaScript. And the reason why, and the reason I argue that people should always reach for them first, is because the array method itself, so things like map, filter, reduce, have pieces of information embedded in them. So as you're skimming things, if you see an array method that's a map, for example, you're always going to have an array. You don't even have to look at what the actual function is. There's going to be an array. If you see a filter, it's going to be array. But if you see a find, it won't be array, or it may be array, but it won't be the container array. And so all these little hints and tricks kind of sprinkle throughout your code, make things easier to read, easier to skim. And that's, really what it's about.
That's really interesting. So I always knew I preferred those types of methods over, a loop of a different type. But I never could really articulate why I preferred them. So now I understand that's exactly it, is that it's more obvious what you're doing. Just through the keywords there of the map, filter, reduce, and so on. Interesting. I like that.
Right. And I think that's kind of what's been nice about a lot of the changes in the language, is they give you more hints and things like that. So one of the other ones that's really common now is the use of the word const, and which a variable declaration that you cannot reassign.
Right.
And that, for me at first that was kind of weird, because a lot of languages use const and you're supposed to never ever use it, like very rarely, maybe data, like a database login or something like that, or the digits of pi or something that like never ever changes. But in JavaScript, it's become really popular for a very similar reason, because you can't reassign it. It kind of frees up what you have a time to think about. So if you see a variable with const, you know that it's not going to change. If you see it 15 lines down, it's going to be the same as it was 15 lines up.
Right.
Whereas when you had just regular variable declarations, you never really knew what you had. So there's a lot more cognitive load as you kind of would skim and read the code.
Yeah. And constants are more efficient to the interpreter. So I don't know the internals of V8 or any. Well, I'm a Node programmer more than a front end. So I guess the engine that interprets on some browsers may be different than V8, but Node uses V8. So, so constants have a more efficient path to usage, or they require less resources in the long term. I use them where you can. I never noticed the cognitive load that took off of you by knowing it's a constant. So that's a really interesting point too. What was the thing that surprised you most about writing the book that you didn't expect going in? Oh, you appear to be muted.
I may have accidentally hit the button. So there's something called, I think it's called Hofstadter's law, Hofstadter. I can't remember. But since the law is everything is going to take longer than you think, even when you take into account that law. And so that's exactly what happened with the book. It took me almost a year to the day from the time I signed the contract to the time it was shipped. And my original estimate was about 6 months. And that included the fact that I was inflating it from what I thought.
Yeah, that's.
I think the thing. Yeah, go ahead.
So, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I try to double everything and it still takes longer. So,
yeah, that's a truth about life and definitely about code and programming. But I think the thing that I kind of surprised me about writing the book, and I guess I kind of expected this too, was it really helped me learn things a little bit more than I thought. It took me like to the next level, mostly because as you're writing it, you don't want to look like an idiot. You don't want to say something wrong. You don't want to lead people down the wrong path. So every time I'd write something, I would double and triple check it. And I learned a few things that I had been mistaken about for a long time. And I don't know if I would say I got addicted to the writing process, but I definitely learned that it's very useful for me, that writing or speaking are ways that are motivators I use to keep myself kind of fresh. So I like to speak at conferences. I also write articles pretty regularly for online publications like Free Code Camp or Pony Foo, which is a newsletter. And just the process of writing about things helps me kind of understand it better. You have to come up with an example. You have to make it abstract. You have to explain it piece by piece. And I think that's a great way to learn. I'm always encouraging people to write things or give talks because I think it makes them better. Just the process of doing it, even if no one reads it or no one listens. Hopefully they will. But merely the process of doing so, I think, improves people's abilities and skills.
Yeah. So what, that's part of the reason I have this podcast is so I get to talk to people like you, but also so the more I talk about things, the more I seem to, get a deeper understanding of them. That's one of the skills I've always had, that seems to be somewhat unique is the ability for me to take an analogy of something technical to describe it to a non-technical person. And every time I do that, I understand the process in a much much deeper way than I did before. Yeah. What, you mentioned that you, realized there were things that you had been doing wrong. Is there anything specific that stands out that, we might learn from?
Let's see. I mean, some of it were kind of silly things like higher order functions. I've been calling higher order functions forever. So just a simple name thing. I don't know how I got it wrong in the first place, but there was some ways I used promises that I realized is wrong based off of essentially how I did some of the error handling and what different things were caught in the process. And I can't remember exactly what that is, but I remember realizing I've been doing it wrong for a while. It still worked, but it probably wasn't optimal. Yeah, that's the only one that really pops into my head.
No, that's you probably couldn't be expecting that kind of question. So
yeah.
You mentioned writing articles. I just happened to today see the article that the title is "Teaching Kids to Code." I won't teach my kids to code, and neither should you. Now, as I told you before we started, I have not actually had a chance to read it, and as we talked about, that the title might be slightly misleading, but if you want to maybe give us a little insight into what sparked that article.
Sure. So so the article is published in Slate. It's fairly well-known publication, but they're kind of known for having a rebellious bent, I guess. Contrarian nature. So that's why I pitched it to them. And I have two small kids right now. One is 3, about to turn 4, and the other one is about 20 months old. So thinking about kids and education stuff, that's all on my mind. And the idea came to me, I can't remember, about a year and so ago. And what happened was my second child was just born. And I was walking in Target to buy some formula. And I look over and, I probably got like 4 hours of sleep that night. I was super tired. And I look over and on the in display, there was a rack of books about teaching his kids to code. Well, so I guess I just saw one of them and I thought, oh, look, a book about teaching kids to code. Man, those things seem like they pop up everywhere. And then I look up and realize it was the entire end cap. And so anyone who knows anything about retail knows that that's like primo real estate. And so this was a full end cap display on the main aisle at Target. And so I was like, this must be something that's like hugely important to people. It must be really on people's minds. And it's funny because so there's an article that came out after I wrote this, but it was Thomas Friedman I think it was about 2 weeks ago. So mid-February, he wrote an article for the New York Times opinion piece about how there's two types of codes your kid needs to learn. One is coding as we know it, writing computer programs, and the other is something about civic code. I don't really know what his point was there. So, so here's the person at the New York Times, huge mouthpiece, and he's telling parents they absolutely have to teach their kids to code. There's the Target with all these products to teach his kids to code. I can't turn a corner without seeing it. And all I could think was, these things don't know anything about writing code. And let me explain what that means. And what that means essentially is writing code. A lot of those books are about syntax. This is how you write an HTML form. This is how you write a for loop. Maybe it's in Python, maybe it's in whatever. Let's make a tic-tac-toe game. And that's, there's nothing wrong with that. But in my experience in the industry, there's so much more to it. And this kind of goes back to some things we were talking about. There's things like creativity, things like what does it mean to be good? Like what is a quality product, both that the user would interact with and the product of code, which is essentially the consumers or other developers. And these are all, what they would call, I guess, soft skills. Soft skills and more like mindset. And you can learn those in a number of ways. And so I think if you want your kid to be a developer, first of all, if you're pushing him into it, you're already setting yourself up for a bad time. Yeah. If they want to go, and this is where I think people misunderstood the article. I'm not saying if my kid wants to learn how to code, if my kid wants to do Lego Mindstorm or whatever, I'm going to say absolutely not under my roof. Of course not. But it's the same thing if he wants to be a baseball player. If he wants to study chemistry, I'm going to support him, in whatever he wants to do. I'm not going to push him into it because I think he's going to fail in life if he doesn't have those skills. Instead, I want to focus on him getting those broad skills that if he chooses to become a developer will make him a good one. And so in the article, I talk about things like one day we were sitting down at his little toddler table, and there was a loose screw on his chair. It's just like an IKEA chair.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, what is this screw for? And I said, oh, well, this is he didn't know it was a screw. He just says, what's that? I said, that's a screw. It helps get hold the chair together. And so I got out the little hex wrench. I showed him how you turn it. I let him turn it. He turned it all the way until it's tight. He turned it all the way until it's off. He took it off. He saw that there was other screws. And so we ended up just kind of messing around, taking things apart and putting them together. And eventually I think he probably wandered off and I had to put it together. But, that's really the development process. It's not memorizing a bunch of syntax. Like you need to know syntax. Obviously, I wrote a book about that. I think it's important. But the thing that separates people who are really good is the ability to take something that's never been done before and figure out a way to do it, or to be curious enough that they go down a path to see how something works. I think a lot of developers are the type of people who take things apart. Who they just want to know. They want to know how things work, even if they don't have the ability or the means to mess with them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's important, especially at a younger age. By the time they get older, again, if that's what they want to do, cool. But even from a non-technical side, we're already teaching kids skills that will make them developers in most grades, and that's called math class. Yeah. If you have a mathematical mind, if you aren't scared of math, then you'll probably do okay. So that's kind of what the article was about. And I think it's just encouraging people to not buy into the hysteria. Code is important, but I want my lawyer to be good at law. I don't want them to program. I want my doctor to be good at medicine. I don't want them to program. It's not as essential of a skill as everyone thinks it is.
Though on the flip side, let me say this first and then I'll get back to the article. I wish the lawmakers had a bit better understanding of how code actually works so they would stop making ridiculous laws. But that's an aside.
Well, true. Yeah.
Back to the article. The reason I wanted to bring it up was, so my son, who is 8, is in a class where they're going to do the Scratch programming thing. I can't remember if it's an after school program or whatever, but it's a short thing. And he wanted to see it beforehand, and we started to play with it just so he could see what it was like. And I was born a programmer. I didn't even know it was a field of a profession until I was in college. I thought it was just something I was playing with. I didn't realize I could actually make it a career. So I've always been into programming since I was like 9 years old. But I was doing it with him, just showing him how it worked, just showing him some of the images and how you could add backgrounds and stuff. And then he started to play with it, and then he would ask how we got another element, and I kept wanting to solve that problem. That's where I was going with as a programmer from the beginning. You put a problem in front of me, my first instinct is to solve it. So it was to get him from 0 to all the way as fast as possible. And then I had to stop and say, wait a minute. The reason that I got good at this and enjoy it is because I poked at it until I understood it myself. So I had to take that step back and say, wait. I'll sit here with him and let him do what he wants. He's right now just sticking a load of monsters on the screen, and I'm helping him make them move back and forth while strange music plays, and that's fantastic for him. But that it was like, oh, we're not programming yet. I got to teach you for loops and how this works and how we make the guy move across it. And it was like, stop that, Dave. You don't need to do that. Yeah. Just let him enjoy it. Let him find that either the passion to do it or not. Either way. But so it was right along with your thinking. I think your thinking actually even a little bit better of seeing that curiosity in other physical objects as opposed to just the digital ones. So I really appreciate that.
And I think that's a common experience for developers. When the article went out, I kind of braced myself. I was like, okay, time to get some hate. And in the comment section where people are pretty pissed off, as people are in comment sections. Although I think sometimes their thought process was misguided. But a lot of developers, I think really got it, because a lot of us had that experience growing up where we gained that curiosity. Who knows how we did it. But at some point it was there. And so I think having closed systems, and that's what a lot of books and tutorials are. There's something, you do X, Y, and Z, you get this.
Yeah.
That's nice for helping you learn a few things, but it's that open-ended will to explore and to find the answer that I think that's why most of us get up every day and enjoy what we do. The reason I want to be a working programmer as opposed to a manager, a project manager, this, that, or the other thing, is because when I'm working on code, I get those moments of flow where, you are so into a problem and you finally get it working and you look up and it's been 2 hours. And actually it's funny because the day I realized I needed to switch careers from being a librarian to doing developing full time was exactly one of those moments. I was working on something. I was trying to connect to an API. I didn't know it was an API at the time. I just knew that someone said, if you put in this URL, then you'll get some data. And I was working on it so hard, and I finally got it working. It was showing the little book images on the screen, and I look up and it was 6:30 and the office was dark. Everyone had left and I hadn't even noticed. And I was just like, what happened? But, it was like, it was such a good feeling that I was like, I want to see that every day. I want that feeling all the time, and so that's something you can't force. That's something that has to be discovered. And some people don't find it in code. I have a brother who's an electrical engineer. He started off, he thought he wanted to be a programmer, and would just realize that he didn't like the part about sitting, and thinking in logic. He liked turning screwdrivers and cutting wires. So he went into electrical engineering. He still has to write code here and there, but for him, the fun part is getting his hands into things. And that's awesome. I'm glad he likes it, that, he likes to do that thing.
Cool. How did you end up starting the Meetup?
The Meetup. So I live in Lawrence, Kansas, which is about 45 minutes outside of Kansas City. Kansas City is a major metro area. And for a long time, I commuted into Kansas City to work, and it was about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the traffic. And so I'm a social person. I like other people. The problem I had was that most of the meetups in Kansas City were evenings. And so I was always stuck with the problem of, if I go to the meetups, I either have to kill like 2 hours in Kansas City because they would start at 7 or something, or I would drive home, stay there for 30 minutes, and then drive back. And then this was after I had a couple of kids. So that was putting, some tension family-wise. Yeah. And so I had this genius idea where I would start a meetup, but it would happen over the lunch hour. That way I could just go during my regular day, hang out with people, and then at night I could go home. So I started that meetup, and then 1 month later, exactly, I got a job working remotely, so I don't have to drive into Kansas City anymore. So ironically, now I only drive into Kansas City to run the meetup. So I always tell everyone it's the worst great idea I ever had. But it's there's no like secret to it. I guess it was one of those things where I thought about doing it for 6 months, and we had JavaScript meetups in Kansas City. There's an Angular meetup, but there wasn't a React meetup, and I knew that there's a lot of React developers, and I knew there was growing. So I thought someone should do it. I'm a someone, and so I got it started, and it actually has been pretty successful. I don't know about meetups in other towns, but we get between 25 and I think one time we had up to 40 people, which is I'd say a pretty solid group. And I think the lunch hour thing really helps a lot. I would encourage people, if they considering a meetup, to think about the lunch hour, because it really does help out a lot of people. Because people have commented to me about how they wish they could go to more than one in the evenings, but they can't because they have to go to volleyball practice or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's a great way to give people an opportunity to learn something. And the nice thing is a lot of times you can get corporate sponsors, so everyone can get a free lunch, and kind of a nice thing.
No, that's a really good idea. Like I go to meetups quite often. I try to limit it to no more than 2 a week at a maximum, and usually I try to keep it at 1. But what happens is I'll have 1 week with 0, and the next week I'll have 2, because of just the way the timing works out. Because I've got 3 smaller kids now. They're not quite as small as they used to be, but my wife would kill me if I was out too much. But I get so much value from them. I get even the ones where the thing is not directly relevant. There's one word that's mentioned, one tool or one technique that I then go and look into more that I wouldn't have heard anywhere else, in the context that made sense to me. So even what can feel like 99% of it wasted my time, that 1% was so valuable that it was a must go. You know what I mean? So I really like that idea of the lunch. Someone mentioned different type of meetup that might happen over lunch at some point, but I hadn't thought about a deeply technical one being a lunchtime one. That's a good idea. I know a few places that have actually had a little bit of an issue, or a few meetups that have had a little bit of an issue with trying to get places at certain times to hold their meetups. So that might be interesting. What was the hardest part of starting a meetup?
This one actually went pretty easily. The hardest part was originally finding locations, and so Kansas, the biggest downside to a lunchtime meetup is that the time is limited. So again, Kansas City is a big metro area, and driving from one side to the other would take the entire lunch hour. So trying to figure out a place where I could get people without excluding people was tough. I don't think I actually solved that problem. We're on one side of Kansas City where a lot of the developers are, not all of them. And so I think we get more people, but we do exclude a chunk of the city. We try and move it around a little bit, but finding the location can be challenging, because the beauty part is a lot of more offices are open, so people are willing to share their space. And they of course derive some benefit. Usually they'll pitch, if they're looking for developers, they'll give a little pitch for their space and a chance to showcase how awesome the company is and all that fun stuff. But they also have meetings and things like that. So we ended up kind of like rotating around a bit. But at this point, it's been about a year since we started it. It's pretty stable. We have 3 or 4 places that are pretty reliable, that we can rotate between them so we don't burn anyone out. But finding that for a while, there's a few times that was, a week or 2 to go. We were still scrambling, trying to find a place to go. Finding speakers can of course be challenging. I think if anyone is planning to start a meetup, they should expect that they will have to talk at least 2, possibly 3 times in the first year. Because as a podcaster, consistency is really important, especially when you're getting started. So making sure that there's something every month, just so people trust you and keep showing up. But again, after you kind of get rolling and you get more people, then that problem starts to go away a little bit too. So I think we were pretty lucky, because there's a high demand for what we do, and at least in my city, in Kansas City, a lot of companies are switching their user interfaces to React even still. And so we get a lot of people who, kind of like, hey, I've just been told that we're changing. I probably should learn this. And, so they'll come and chat a little bit or watch the presentation. There's also a couple of coding boot camps in our city that use React. And so we get a lot of people who are recent graduates from that, who are looking to network. And so it's been a really good experience, with people from all over the spectrum, people who've been doing it forever, people who are just starting, and everything in between.
Do you see much uptake in Vue.js?
That's not super popular in Kansas City. And one thing I always find really interesting is how some of these things happen geographically. So Kansas City is a huge .NET town, .NET all over the place. And then I would say it's probably 75% React and 25% Angular. And I hardly ever see any Vue or any Ember or anything else, even back a few years. And, part of it makes sense, because if people learn something at one company, they switch and they go to another company. And they kind of take that knowledge with you. But for a while, I worked at a company that did Ruby on Rails, and we had the hardest time finding developers, just because there was not a ton of Ruby shops. Whereas other places, they're everywhere. Omaha has a ton of Ruby developers. So it's strange the way that happens from a city to city way, but I guess that's just how it goes.
Yeah, that's I like React, but one of the things that worries me is the amount of control obviously Facebook would have over the direction of React. I know some of their licensing has changed over the last 8 to 12 months to make some of the worries lessen, but still, they can control so much of the direction of it that it can be an issue for some people, I think, with how they may be able to implement certain elements, depending on what sort of problems they bump into. And I guess that's really more to do with React Native than React in the experiences I've had. Have you seen any kind of issues with anything there related to React and the direction of it with regards to?
No, but I completely understand that viewpoint. And I would admit that as someone who uses a lot of open source technologies, we probably don't think critically about that enough. But I had an experience that actually fits right in with that, which is Angular, back before it became Angular JS, the new version.
Yeah.
I was working at a company and Angular was the hotness. So I built this huge thing in Angular. It took all this time and all this work, and it finished, and I was really happy. And exactly 1 week after it finished, they gave a big talk at some conference where that was when they essentially deprecated the original Angular 1 and said, we're getting rid of this, that, and the other thing, and we're going to start with Angular 2. And I remember just sitting there thinking, I spent 4 months working on this thing, and you're telling me that it's deprecated in 2 years. I'm going to have to do the whole thing over again. Yeah. And so ironically, then I started using React because I was so mad at them.
Mm-hmm.
But, what's to say that the same thing doesn't happen there?
Oh yeah. Definitely.
And the one thing that does worry me about React is how the way applications are made in it, it's React all the way down.
Yeah.
So you can't just, as much as everyone complains about jQuery, at least at the end of the day, if you shut down jQuery, you still have the HTML and the CSS. You can't just pick and choose which part of a React app you're going to save. It's kind of all nested together. I imagine there's ways around it, and you could split things up, but it's definitely not going to be as easy.
Yeah, so my React experience is very minimal. Like even the demo prototypes I did were base. They were nothing. So my knowledge is not extensive, but one of the reasons I like Vue the most is that the creator, I always forget his name. I must write that down somewhere. Was on the Angular 1 project, and he basically took the good parts of that and a lot of what makes React nice and turned it into Vue. So it's a progressive set of elements. So you don't have to have it Vue all the way down. You can have a small portion of the page, have Vue elements. So those are a couple of the reasons that I'm interested in it. We haven't actually started to use it yet, and it seems to be growing in popularity, especially from the East, China, India area, and moving this way through Europe. But, it's really hard to tell with all of these technologies what's here in 6 to 8 months and what new thing we've never heard of that will be the new hotness.
Yeah.
What's got you excited? Anything new on the horizon, technology wise, or?
Oh, let's see. Nothing specific. The new version of React came out of alpha, which uses something called hooks, and that has gotten everyone excited, me as well. I'm always interested in the JavaScript updates. The one I'm super excited about, which is going to be a while, is something called the pipeline operator, which essentially composes functions so they pass data right into the next function. And that one looks like it's going to be a while because Babel had an interesting post on how implementing it is not straightforward based off of how some people think async and await should work. So always looking onto those things. personally, I find one of the other things that's really fun about development is we're always obsessed with the next new thing. But what's really interesting too is a lot of times how what's old is new again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been doing some stuff with state machines, which have been around for decades. I've been playing around with abstract syntax trees, which have obviously been around even longer than that. So just kind of constantly bringing in, relearning things that have been around for a while and then starting to use them in new ways. That's one of the fun parts about it. Learning something new, reimagining something old, trying something out. It's all fun.
Yeah.
Have a good time.
What are hooks exactly? I haven't looked into those.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what in some cases hooks are, but in the realm of React.
Sure. I'm going to probably do a horrible job explaining them. So don't take my word for it, whoever's listening. But a hook essentially is, so React used to store state on classes. There's you would make a property called state, and then you would add stuff to it, and the React engine would know how to would make updates based off of how you change that. So if you change something in the state property, it would know it would have to re-render things further down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And so a hook is a way to manage state in a functional component as opposed to a class-based component.
Oh, okay.
And so you, inside of a function, you essentially create a new state, and then you get a pair. The first item is the item in state, and the second is the function to update it. And so now you can create stateful components inside functional components. And the way they do it under the hood is super interesting. I don't fully understand. So again, this is even take this with an even bigger grain of salt. But the best way to do it is to think about an error handling. So if you have a state, if you want to set a state, then you call it, and it essentially pauses the running of the application and looks for the nearest state handler. Kind of the way that if you throw an error, the application stops processing and looks for the closest catch statement or error handling statement.
Right.
So it's a way, to make things that are functional that kind of can pause the runtime almost. It's super interesting. But the part that has made everyone so excited about it is that it reduces a lot of boilerplate, so it makes things easier to see. And it makes it easier to switch the way you would use a component. So you can have a component that has a state and then a component that doesn't. And it used to take a lot of work to kind of switch them back and forth. Now it's just one or two lines of code. So pretty nice.
Interesting. Yeah, it's enough of a teaser that now I have to look into it. What do you have coming up for yourself? Any new books or articles or projects?
Let's see. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I like to write. And so I write regularly for Pony Foo. So if you are interested in what I have to write, subscribe to their newsletter because they have a bunch of good stuff and a lot of people who write for Beyond Me.
I'll add right now, links for all this in the show notes.
Sure.
So that they can get to it.
Yep. So for them, I'm writing articles about testing in Jest and specifically mocking things, which is one of my favorite things about Jest is how easy it is to mock different functions. Have a few talks this year, not as many as I do in years past, but for those in the Midwest, if you haven't gone to Kansas City Developer Conference, it's an awesome conference, and it's for developers, just a general conference. I guess kind of towards the web developer end, but there's stuff about all sorts of languages. They're going to be talking there about refactoring JavaScript, and then also ethics in programming. As I mentioned, studied philosophy, so I'm always kind of keep one foot in that realm. Mm-hmm. And so that's I guess what's coming up for me.
Very cool. Anything else that you want to talk about that we haven't covered so far?
No, I think this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it.
No, it's been great. I really appreciate you joining us, and I'm sure the listeners have enjoyed it as well. What would you leave people with? Anything that you'd like them to do other than subscribe to the newsletter?
I guess if you are interested in getting a hold of me, the best place is on Twitter. My handle is Joe S. Morgan. That's probably the most active thing that I have going right now. And honestly, I'm not too active on there. I try and keep my mouth shut unless I feel like I actually have something of value to add to the conversation. But if you ever want to get a hold of me, DMs are open. I love to hear from people. I usually respond, so don't hesitate. And otherwise, I think that's about it. Check out the book. Again, it's called Simplifying JavaScript. It's on Amazon. It's also published through Pragmatic Programmers. So if you go there, they often have discounts around holidays. So check out that, and you may get a pretty good discount on it sometime.
Fantastic. And what skill level should a person be at for your book? Junior,
I think
mid-level?
Probably junior junior or mid-level. I assume that you know programming, but they don't necessarily know JavaScript programming. Mm-hmm. So a friend of mine who's a Python developer who has taken on more JavaScript responsibilities, she found out it was a really good fit for her because she knew a lot of the concepts, but it was more about how to do things in a JavaScripty way, so to speak, versus writing Python code in JavaScript, which is one of the challenges of moving between languages.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, from just talking to you, I think I could learn a good deal from the book. I just haven't had an opportunity to get it yet, but I'd consider myself pretty advanced in my old age. But it still sounds like I could learn a thing or two. So I was just making sure.
Well, if anything, I hope it's just a different perspective, because sometimes I think that's one of the best parts too of learning new things. Not necessarily learning something new, but learning about a different way about approaching problems or thinking about things.
All right, excellent. And if you ever have another book or anything that's on your mind, let me know. We can always have you back. It'd be a pleasure. So,
great. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Until next time, remember, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.